Mr. Comey, I think most Americans, all Americans, believe that this is a country of law, and the rule of law ought to dominate. And I think many folks were struck over the last 8 years during the Bush administration. There seemed to be a certain view of the law that struck them as new and different. And the view of the law, particularly when you got into national security issues, was that the president had a unitary power, that it was dominant. It's flowed from Article 2 and the executive power, included the commander-in-chief, the oath of office to protect the country. And so there was some confusion that entered into what the rule of law meant. What does the rule of law mean to you?
Yeah, I think there were people in the last administration who had a fairly expansive view of the presidential authority in all areas touching on national security, and had a sense that Congress's authority was much more limited than Congress thought it was. Yeah, the rule of law is difficult to define in the abstract. I think it's rooted in people making careful decisions that respect precedent about the balance of powers that's reflected in our Constitution. I think one of the, I don't want to give you too long an answer, but I think one of the challenges of the last administration, my friend Jack Goldsmith from Harvard Law School wrote a book called The Terror Presidency, and he says what he thinks the Bush administration forgot is that there's a difference between hard power and soft power, and that there is the granted authority of the president, but then there's also the authority the president gains from the American people by virtue of involving them and their elected representatives. And that the wisest of our presidents, he cites Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, surrendered some of their hard power, or at least risked surrendering it, by inviting Congress into their, what you might otherwise argue is their exclusive sphere of control in national security, but by doing that gained more power in total. Because the American people were now supports a powerful, powerful force. We're now supporting what you did. I know your question about the rule of law, but I think that Jack makes a very compelling case that the founders may have intentionally set up our Constitution to create an uneasy balance between Congress's authority in the warfighting era and the president, but that the wisest presidents understand that it's not just about what hard powers I claim, but it's much more broadly about what is the credibility of the action I want to undertake.
So for folks coming out of the Vice President Cheney's office, and particularly David Addington, who was Vice President's principal legal advisor, their view that FISA was a kind of unnecessary hindrance of executive power, and their view that judicial review and scrutiny in the area of enemy combatants and other areas. Do you have a skeptical view of that interpretation? That FISA should be put aside, that judicial review is something that should be minimized in the area of national security at a time of war?
I do. I'm a very practical person. I'm not smart enough to be a serious academic. And I think that what a view like that ignores is, even if you think, in the quiet of your room late at night, that FISA is an impermissible infringement on the president's national security authorities, if you understand how FISA works and the way in which it is part of the fabric of our intelligence community, you would understand that whatever my theoretical concerns might be about FISA, I actually can enhance the president's authority to protect the American people by embracing it, when my core academic instinct may be to blow up FISA. I don't happen to believe that, as I said earlier today. FISA is as much a part of the fabric of intelligence collection in this country as Miranda is in law enforcement. And there are plenty of theorists who say Miranda's an awful thing, but you talk to cops, they'll tell you, Miranda's great, I wouldn't want to do away with it, both because of the discipline it instills in the men and women who work for me, and because it's part of our culture. I think that's true of FISA as well.
And did you find mainline folks on the front lines of the war against terrorist plots in America complaining about FISA? Did they find it to be a handcuff that weakened them and exposed the country to attack?
No. I think many of them would tell you that they like it because it offers them the discipline driven into them by the need to prepare affidavits and to summarize facts for a judge, and frankly the support, and they wouldn't say it this way, and I don't mean it to sound negative, but the cover offered by a federal judge saying, this is an appropriate exercise of your authority. And I think they would laugh at people having debates about the scope of the president's authority and the scope of Congress's authority, they'd say, look, I'm trying to find spies and terrorists, and I think this is a good tool to do it.
Mr. Mondale, you, through the investigation on the Church Committee and then your leadership in the Senate, and then as Vice President of the United States, played leadership role in putting together FISA. And you were criticized at the time by Democrats and civil libertarians for giving away too many of Americans' liberties in your concern about national security. Looking back on FISA and its history and the system it set up, do you think American civil liberties were compromised?
No, I don't. I'd be interested in Mr. Comey's view. The idea was to make public officers accountable in an area that is fiendishly difficult, an area that almost by nature has to be secret. How do you make that accountable then to the American system? We chose to establish a House and Senate Committee on Intelligence, which can hold its hearings and sometimes does in secret. We set up a system under Ed Levy of federal regulations that govern this, and then we set up the FISA court. So we did the best we could to find a way of protecting America, yet holding the system as accountable as we could to the law, while recognizing the need for secrecy. And I think it's the best we could come up with, and time has suggested some changes. For example, when we did this, as I mentioned last night, we had land phones and we had Western Union. That was it. That's all we had to worry about. Now you've got all this new stuff that just floods the communication system, so it requires some adjustment. But that doesn't bother me so long as we keep the accountability principle as best we can, so that nobody in positions of power in America can run free without having to some way share their judgment with somebody. That seems to me we're not good people, where we can come together on the questions that Mr. Comey asked.
Yeah.
That seems like a great example of area for common ground.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's impossible to answer that question about civil liberties with a yes or a no, because it's a constant balance. Yeah. That, like all human enterprises, it's imperfect, and we're constantly trying to get it right. And I mean, just take the Fourth Amendment, which says, there shall be no unreasonable searches and seizures. Well, the courts have been struggling since the founding of the Republic to figure out what is reasonable and what's unreasonable, and it moves back and forth, back and forth. I think the point you make, though, is the most important. All of us, especially when we're doing the most important high-stakes stuff, need checks and balances. And we need, even honest people need to be kept honest. And so I very much believe in the rigorous institution of inspectors general, sort of an in-house, independent cop to look over your shoulder. And I think oversight by the intelligence communities is critically important. If you know, just as in FISA, the reason the agents like it, if I know I have to tell a federal judge what I'm about to do, I'm going to be a lot more careful about it, even for the best intention of person, because I know it's going to be reviewed. If I know the intelligence communities are really going to review what I'm doing, I'm going to be careful about it. And if the Inspector General is really independent and is going to call it as he or she sees it, that's going to help me. All of those things, those mechanisms, I mean, doctors try to build them into hospitals. Oversight and review and peer review, it will keep you, and I guess I don't mean keep you honest, it will make you better, especially as you try to strike these balances.